Thank you, Tommy. Thank you very much for your invitation. It's a great honor to be part of this workshop. So I was asked to give the shortest presentation about the history of face identification, because it's a long history. So I will give you just a few small glimpses into that. And yeah, I hope you can see something here, because it's... Yeah, so when you speak of identification, at least for human identification, you automatically think about faces. So why faces? Because in fact, we have bodies, we have hands. So one explanation is given here. If somebody is asked to look at a scene, if you see his gaze of this person, he's looking automatically first at the faces. So faces are what attract attention. And in fact, we have been interested in faces for a very long time. And so if you look before the modern times, what happened in Europe, because that's what I know, until the 19th century, there were mostly interest in two main things about faces. It was not identification, but physiognomy. At the time, it was not identification, but the belief that your face would tell something about your inner self. And the other interest was for face and body proportion, the idea that beauty is related to having ideal proportion. So if we look for this in the antiquity, famous Greeks are known to have been interested in physiognomy, and also Vitruvius was interested in ideal body and face proportion, and he's mostly known by this drawing from Leonardo da Vinci showing ideal proportion in the human body. Then in the Middle Age and in the Renaissance, there were in the UK Scott and in Germany Dürer, and here you have an example of the drawings of Dürer trying to find out what are the typical proportion in the face. And in the 18th and 19th centuries, there was still a lot of interest for this physiognomy. And here you have an example from the book of Duchenne, who was one of the first ones to use photography in his books. It had a lot of success, and then you have to wait until the end of the 19th century to find the idea that faces could be used also for identification. So in France, there was Bertillon, it was a policeman, and he developed the method of anthropometry. So measuring the body for the purpose of identification. And it is finally in 1970 that there is then an explosion of face-related research. But before speaking about that, I would just show that research goes in cycle, because nowadays we are back to physiognomy. This is called now faceism. But it's exactly the same thing, that investigating if you can tell out of a face any special social characters, and also investigating if it has any truth in it. But this was just an aside, so I would like to come back to identification. And in Europe, in the UK, it's when it started, because there was some very famous criminal investigations where there was some trouble with witnesses recognizing criminals. And the UK, the government wanted to, invested money in research. They wanted to know how good are we at recognizing faces, how reliable are testimonies of witnesses. And so in 1975, there is a review by Ellis, and it's quite sobering when you read this paper, because he already identified all the main parts of what is the question in face recognition. It is one, there is the fact of face, or something like the orientation, the way you present it, influence recognition, but also who is looking at the face, the participant or the witness also plays a role, like his age, or if it's the race. And also another thing that he investigated or he reported about is are faces special? Already at the time they knew that babies shows an interest for faces, so it's an innate interest for faces. They also speak about, it was already well known, the inversion effect. And it was also known about prosopagnosia, that there are people that have selectively problem in recognizing faces, but not other types of objects. So that's why I said it's sobering. In fact, in this review, most of the themes that are cited are still current nowadays. And after that, there was such an explosion, as I said, of research about faces that I didn't find that it was good to speak in terms of chronological development. I will just give you a few of the main aspects of face recognition or identification. So these are the 7 that I will speak about, and I will start with what I think is the most important one. Is for humans there is a very large difference between recognizing familiar and unfamiliar faces. And here is an example for you. These are famous faces, and you have no trouble to identify them, even if they are shown very strongly distorted or in a very degraded way. Here are the answers. While for unfamiliar faces, that's completely different. Here is an ideal lineup. So if you think of criminal investigation, because you have, if you want, the criminal would be here, and here is the lineup. And the question was, is this person present in this lineup? And these pictures were done on the same day with the same orientation, the same facial expression. So you cannot have that good in a criminal investigation. And what they find is that, in fact, participants in such a task were about 70% correct. It's not good enough, I think, in terms of witness reliability to send somebody to jail. Yeah, here's the answer. Then another well-known fact is the owned race are recognized more easily than other race faces. And here is an example for that's easier for Asian observers tell which of these 2 faces represent the same person as here. This is the president of Korea. And for Caucasian, then this is easier, even if you don't know the faces. It's easier for your own race faces. Yeah, and here are the answers. Another important thing, you have already spoken about holistic processing, and this is for robust identification, you need holistic processing. Holistic processing is something really nobody agrees about exactly what it is, how you can define it. So I will give you a very general kind of a description of that. First, you need to detect a face. This is given by the first order configuration. This is that you have the eyes above the mouth. So this is a face, this is not a face. For identification, then holistic processing means that you integrate into a whole the second order configuration, so the distance between the features, and also information about the shape or the color of the eyes or some other facial features. And only when you have these together integrated can you have a reliable and fast identification. And from that follows that if you reduced holistic processing, then you would also reduce identification performance. And that's what you find if you invert the faces or, for example, in prosopagnosia. This is the composite effect is a good example to explain holistic processing. If I show you this face and I tell you who is it, there are 2 persons in that. It's quite hard to tell, but if I show them misaligned, then it's much easier to see which are the 2 different identities. So this is because we perceive face holistically, so we cannot look selectively at only one part and ignore the other one. Then, of course, it's important to understand or to have an explanation about how we code faces in memory, and this is where face space come into talk. Here, a very simple representation of face space. There should be a 2-dimensional representation of this multi-dimensional face space. This would be our own race faces would be there, other race faces a bit further away. And the norm, the center of would be in the center of the distribution. And the idea is that any face are coded relative to these face norms, that similar faces are located close to each other. And so when there is a new faces coming onto our retina, then it would be in this face space, it would be identified as the closest face that's encoded there if it's close enough. And this idea of a norm-coded phase space has been validated behaviorally, but I will skip the explanation about how that was done. Then some parts of the phases are more important than others. I think that's quite obvious. If I show you this and ask who is shown, at least I hope that it works, that it's easier to identify the faces when you see the eyes when you see, for example, the lips. Then something that, because the techniques of showing faces has got better with time, there was this also important finding that more ecological presentation benefits identification. So, for example, if you have moving faces, especially non-rigid motion, it helps identify a face. Also, if you show the face attached to a body, even any body, would help identification. And being an active observer, being able to look at the faces in your own way is also important. Yes. Then the last part is something that I've done in my lab, is about if you want to recognize a face, you have to compare with what you have encoded about this face. So what we investigated is, what do you remember really about really familiar faces, personally familiar faces? And what you remember is idiosyncratic information about their identity. If you see moving faces, it would be also about motion. But you have other kind of information, like the gender, the race, or the facial proportion. And so what we did to investigate this is that we had faces of colleagues, because they are personally familiar, and we manipulated the faces either in terms of identity information, so we morphed these colleagues with unfamiliar faces in steps, so that each face was accompanied by morphs that were getting more and more similar to the extremes of this continuum in two directions, so that each face was always in the center of the distribution. And here, as you see, only the identity is changing, but it's still the sex and the race of the face stay the same. Then here it's my own face, and here the manipulation is in terms of race. So here I'm getting more Caucasian looking, and here more Asian looking. And again, my real face is in the center of the distribution. So what we did is we showed all these, for each face together with its own distractors, and the task of the participant, that were all other colleagues, was find the real face that matched the colleagues you know. And we did that then for each of these faces separately. And this is the average response from all our participants. And what you see is that participants showed most often the original face for the identity morphs. These squares here represent the two extremes of the distribution. So mostly you have a peak distribution around the original face. And this is when you change the race, you find something similar when you change the sex. You don't find that peak distribution around the original face in the distribution. So what do you remember about familiar faces? In fact, you have quite a precise representation of the idiosyncratic features which make the identity of a face. But when it comes about the category membership, like the sex or the race, we just remember, in fact, the membership, which category it belongs to, but not more. And in fact, it was done by the Burton lab about natural proportion of faces, and they similarly showed that the participants, even for familiar faces, don't really can give the real the real proportion of the face. And so, as I've already a little bit spoke about, during all this development of face research, there was an improvement of how you display faces and what you can do with that. So one thing is to be able to manipulate real faces, natural faces. That's what, for example, our Max Planck face database can do. And here you see Harnisch getting more and more Asian looking. and you still recognize him across the images, I hope. Then faces can be animated, so you can show videos of real faces, but you can also animate face avatars. And you can, this is here an example of an avatar that's animated by the real motion of a real face. And you can show faces now with their bodies or together with full-bodied avatars. And by having active observers and using virtual reality, here you see what an active observer is looking when he's looking at faces in virtual reality. Of course, there are many other techniques, for example, the bubble techniques that then manipulate what is visible in a face. And all these other techniques, in addition to behavioral studies, that, and also, of course, modeling, that allows to have more glimpse and understanding into what is underlying face identification. So, in a short summary, I think the main thing is to really notice that there is an important difference between familiar and unfamiliar face identification, that your holistic processing is what is needed for a quick and robust identification, and that more ecological presentation benefits identification, at least for humans. And with that, I would like to thank you for your attention.